Okay, so previously we have demonstrated how to look at the financial data for key banks that were subjected to fines. The database we're using, or the dataset, was the Financial Times dataset spanning 2007, 2015. And we had looked using Y-Finance, Yahoo Financial's Beautiful Soup requests, and Pandas. We had put into operation methods for scraping data from different portals, Yahoo Finance in particular, and Wikipedia and the Federal Reserve. Uh, we also had looked previously at the balance sheet data, applied some standard analysis. Now, just to put into the frame how big in terms of profits these US banks are in terms of financial services, we could copy this URL. So Control C, Control V, and just open up. And we can observe here, I think this is organized by sales, so revenue. In fact, the leading financial service companies, it's a global index, so not just US. We can see Chinese, German, French, Italian, Canadian institutions here. But if we're to try put in the frame via the profitability of these institutions, you can see that JP Morgan had profits in 2021 of 29 billion. Bank of America here had 17 billion. Fannie Mae, Citigroup 11 billion, Goldman Sachs 9 billion, and Wells Fargo a little bit further down, right? Okay, so if we run this command, we can see here we've pulled the data in, and that data table is reproduced in our Google Colab, this Jupyter notebook. We could do another report here. Could we just select those institutions that we have a particular interest in because of the fining regime that was put in place? And so we might be curious about the level of profitability of the different institutions. And we can see that given JP Morgan share price and its cumulative returns, it's been doing extremely well. In part, we can see also underpinning that is very strong profitability relative to its peers. But Goldman Sachs also has strong profits. Wells Fargo a little bit less. Citigroup, strong performer. Bank of America better, but standing out here, very prominent in terms of profitability, is JP Morgan. And we can sort that using Pandas, take our 50 or so leading financial institutions and filter so that we bring across just those companies that are headquartered in the US and have that are Bank of America, JP Morgan, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs. And if it's just for US companies and just organize in ascending order, a descending order going from the highest to the lowest, we can see here JP Morgan, the Transamerica Corporation would appear to be a holding company. Then we have JP Morgan, Bank of America, Fannie Mae, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, and so on. Wells Fargo a little bit further down. Okay, so that sort of puts in context the size of these financial institutions and their level of profitability. We could also look at the largest companies by revenue. Again, it's a different URL. We could take a look at that directly, and we can apply the filters then. Look, we want it to be headquartered for the US, and the industry is banking. And then sort in descending, so ascending false, so descending order by profits. If we run that report and bring it in from Wikipedia, you can see, and again, I think I've already been very specific about being JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. Why Goldman falls out? It's because it's an investment services sector. Largest global banks. So actually, that's the same. That's the same report. That's the same URL as before. it's this URL, the largest global banks in 2022. So this one is different. Just we might take a look at this one. Control C. I'll paste in Control V. Largest banks. It's a different data set, and it's the largest banks, and we're organizing by total assets. So the list is based on the April 2023 S&P Global Market Intelligence report of the 100 largest banks. The data is 2022 data, and the Chinese banks dominate in terms of total assets. Then JP Morgan, Bank of America, and then some foreign banks on the list. So if we go back in and we take the data from that source, and then we organize it okay, so let's just run that report using requests, Beautiful Soup, and Pandas. You can see we replicate the data set that was provided from the Wikipedia portal. Okay, okay, so that just gives us a sort of sense of how significant these US banking institutions are. American banks are not the biggest banks in the world. They are quite big, and maybe the Chinese banks are a little bit inflated because of the real estate boom they've been going through, and possibly there could be corrections also in terms of the scale of the banks. We've seen that in other jurisdictions when the property markets fall. Banks very often are affected negatively by that. So, but for the moment, the Chinese banks are obviously bigger than their US peers. And if I remember correctly, no Chinese bank was fined, appears in the FT Financial Times data set, right? So they don't really impinge on our analysis in this instance, right? Now, if I run this report, it's pulling the data from the Financial Times data set. It won't work because I need to upload when you close down your Colab and go back to the Colab, you always have to upload your data. So the data is this data here, and that's the Financial Times data set. Now that'll upload, takes a second. I have to bring that data in, and just to run the report here, how do we bring in? We have to go back to our pandas. So the first one, second, third. So to read in the data, we have to apply import pandas and then read the data. If I execute this code, it won't work because the name of the file is not adhering to the name in our content folder. So we need to rename the content, the data file, to be just data.csv. Okay, and we run again, and it's fine. And just to make sure it's there. Okay, so all seems good. Now we want to go back to where we had started off here, this particular session. And I'm looking at the largest global banks in 2022 and a little bit further along. Okay, so I want to look now at the reasons for the fines being applied. And there were 7 categories. So we run this pandas command to identify those unique titles in the reasons column of the data set. And there are 7: mortgage-backed securities, foreclosures, mortgage repurchases, sanctions, money laundering, tax evasion, lending consumer practices, market manipulation, mergers, acquisitions. I've tried to, here in a text cell, and I formatted this using Markdown, in this text cell here, provide a little bit of context for the categories developed in the Financial Times data set. And mortgage-backed securities are a key element. If we go back to the 2008 2010, 11, 12 financial crisis. At the epicenter was the securitization process, and then the lending practices, the trading of mislabeled fixed income instruments, so mortgage-backed securities were very often sold, where institutions advised clients to buy into mortgage-backed securities that they passed off as being of a much stronger credit quality than what was real and what most people understood at the time. Most professional investors would have understood back in 2006, 7, 8, that period. Many mortgage-backed securities, in fact, were substandard. There was for issues, especially with Wells Fargo, in terms of foreclosures, that the paperwork wasn't done appropriately. Mortgage repurchases, there was issues for big international banks like BNP Paribas, very often violations in terms of sanctions, money laundering, tax evasion. The Swiss banks in particular had issues around bank secrecy. There was lending consumer practices that were undesirable. There was market manipulation, in particular of the key reference rates like LIBOR, where very large fines were paid by US and UK banks. And then a smaller area, but not insignificant, was mergers and acquisitions. And they were the 7 areas that the Financial Times categorized, and they became, for each fine then, they were each classified as one of these 7 areas. Okay, so the explanations provided here, I won't go too deep. Also, there was the 7th column in the data set was this FTSE URL. I want to drop it because actually it was just empty cells. And if I run data describe, the descriptive statistics haven't changed from before. And now if I take a look at the data, you can see the FT URLs have disappeared. So they're no longer there. The descriptions are there, the reasons for the fines being applied, the regulators, the name of the bank in question is there, and the date on which the fine occurred is there. And we could take, if we wanted to just look at the top 30 fines, we could just do dot head 30, or if you wanted to make the top 10, we can limit that to 10 rows of data. And we could sort the bank fines data set by value. So we could look at, now it's already organized like that, but ascending faults means descending. So we're going from the highest value to the lowest. And let's make this the top 10 fines. Right. And, you know, maybe or if we want to go back to the top 40. And put in our parentheses. Okay, now when I come down a little further here, we can see if we just trace through who has been applying the fines, very active here is the Department of Justice. And the Department of Housing had some quite substantial fines. Fannie Mae, Federal Housing Agencies, Department of Justice, again, BNP Paribas, Citigroup was fined for mortgage-backed securities. Again, Department of Justice fined JP Morgan 6 billion on mortgage-backed securities. Wells Fargo for their some abuses in terms of how they went about foreclosing certain individuals who were not in who had to foreclose or who ran into difficulties with their mortgages. Okay, now I've tried to provide a sort of generalized overview of that, so key takeaways. I'll leave that there. Perhaps that's something that if you come back, I'll leave a link to the Colab in the down below. So that's something you can do. And we can also look at those banks that seem to have received the top fines. Now, part of the analysis here should be maybe looking at which institutions, if we identify 3 of the 5 banks, so I'm going to identify here JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs, and see is there similarities and dissimilarities in the way different institutions were treated. Now, using the 2007 to 2015 data set, Goldman seems to have been fined less than its peers. In some respects, we might say they're being treated more leniently. Part of the story is the fines that came to Goldman. Some very substantial fines came in 2016. I leave a link there to some of that. Not this one, the other one. Actually this one, where we can see some substantial fines were paid in 2016. And if you trace through that, you can see some substantial, significant fines were paid by Goldman. But in the ether and in some academic papers, academics have drawn attention to the fact that those institutions that make substantial political donations, have strong political connections, tend to do better. So there's a few there, UNU, there's Korea, 2014, and Files observed that the cooperation with the SEC increases the risk of receiving sanctions, but cooperation coupled with timely disclosure tends to precipitate lower monetary penalties overall. And there is a sense that the Goldman lawyers' compliance were quite performative and may have, for a period at least, shielded Goldman from fairly significant fines being imposed. That could be one way of looking at the fines. If we were to start, if we wanted to do some analysis around that, to what extent did we have a tale of two cities when we're looking at JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs? We could identify those fines, so the top fines for Goldman. So again, I'm going to set this question up. So basically, I've teed up a question here that may be based on something and may be based purely on conjecture. But to answer the question, the first place we might start here is to employ Pandas and see what fines were applied and go to the FTSE 100 FTSE dataset and filter out the fines that were applied to Goldman. So I'm going to go to our data, and I'm going to identify the bank as being Goldman Sachs, and then identify the bank as Bank of America and bank as JP Morgan. So we're looking at our data, and I'm filtering the data or selecting the columns and filtering the rows where we have Goldman rows, Bank of America, and JP Morgan. And then I'm going to look at the top 10 fines in terms of the value millions. So that's the top 10 fines for Goldman, Bank of America, JP Morgan. And then initially here, we're going to print out the fines for Goldman. And the top 10 fines for Goldman, in fact, we don't have 10. We get 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the magnitude of the fines are substantially less when we compare to Bank of America. So when we look for the top 10 fines for Bank of America, we actually do get 10. And the fines range from 16 billion all the way down to 335 million. And when we apply the same filtering to JP Morgan, the top fine for JP Morgan is 6 billion. And then the lowest fine, the 10th highest fine on JP Morgan is 613 million. So it's fairly clear in terms of fines here. Bank of America takes the biggest hit, JP Morgan a bit less, and Goldman for the period 2007-2015 a lot less. Now, in part, we might be able to relate back the stock price performance. I mean, we can tell a story here. It may not be a true story, but using the cumulative returns here that we observed before, Bank of America, and if you look at the top performing financial institutions, the two that come off best, JP Morgan, and then Goldman Sachs. And Bank of America does, the BAC performs, it's a lot weaker. Now, part of the story is that 87 billion of fines from the period 2000 to 2023, using the data from the violation tracker, but it's also evident from the Financial Times data set that Bank of America took some sizable hits in terms of fines here. So let's go back to the analysis. Now again, this is very circular. We might note that the logic here may not necessarily be that the regulators pick the winners and losers. The logic might be those banks that were engaged in the most egregious activities were fined hardest, and because the corporate governance issues were very challenged, the stock price performance deteriorated as a result. So not necessarily as a direct result of fines, but this could be a story of correlation rather than causation. But it opens the door for that type of analysis, that the fines, when imposed, actually have reputational damage on financial institutions. Okay, now to get a deeper picture here and to delve in a little bit more, we could use pivot tables. And one of the very nice features about Pandas is it allows us to do quite complex pivot tabling, a lot more sophisticated than normally what's available in Excel. And you can also graph some of these pivot tables. So if we want to run a pivot table where we look at the fines imposed by regulators and break it down per year. So we're going to take our data and then take the date, so 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and look at the sum of fines imposed by each of the regulators over the period, right? We may be able to look at the most active regulators. Okay, so in our analysis of the data set that we were working through, one nice takeaway here could be built on pivot tables. What was the level of fines set out for each regulator? We had 30 regulators, and we're going to break it down by year. Now, if we transpose that, it might be easier actually to read our data. So let's just transpose that pivot table. And we'll put here on the horizontal axis going across the amount, the year, and then the regulator on the vertical axis. And then we can break it down, the total amount of fines applied by each of the regulators. And in that sense, we can also look at the historic application of fines, but we could also sort the pivot table. So an interesting thing to do here, to look at the most prominent regulator, the most active regulator in terms of applying fines over the period, we could sort the pivot table by the total column, and do it in descending order. So we take the same instruction again, but we're going to organize the pivot table in descending order, go for from the highest to the lowest. And we can see here, let's take that down. The Department of Justice, 52 billion of fines. Then the Department of Housing, 26, Federal Housing Agency, 25, Fannie Mae, Office of the Controller of the Currency, 10, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the New York Department of Financial Services, Security and Exchange Commission, further down. So you can see the main actors here. As we go further down, we're looking at, the Attorney General's office or the district attorney, and they are less significant players. And the Department of Justice would look to be the most active. Now, a little bit of a caveat here. Department of Justice rarely acts completely autonomously from other agencies. And so while the SEC is parked down here, maybe in 10th place or 8th or 9th place, very often you have task forces that are set up that are multi-agency, that take on board the opinions of staff right across a whole range of different agencies. And a fine, for instance, might start life in this SEC, but to apply a very big fine, especially if you're taking on, the legal departments of banks that are very well staffed, you probably do need to bring in the Department of Justice. So in terms of footwork here, it might appear that the Department of Justice is the most proactive regulator of financial institutions. It's quite likely that agencies like the Federal Deposit, the FDIC, although the amount of fines that are applied here would appear to be quite low, in fact, could be quite active. And again, that's I've left a link to the Zering paper in this collab, and that's one of the points he makes sort of abundantly clear, that even though small fines have been applied, the day-to-day activity, what a regulator must do, is probably being done by some of these agencies that are not up there with these prominent numbers. But the pivot table is a useful way to see how the fines are crafted and which agencies are brought in when very significant fines are applied. And the Department of Justice here would look to be a very significant agency. Their skill sets probably are quite central to bringing in terms of a fine culminating and a very severe like a fine of 50 of the 16 billion that was applied to Bank of America, that had to be really tight legally. And so I'm sure that's why Department of Justice, with its legal expertise, would be brought in terms of applying fines. Okay. But again, the story can be told using the pivot tables, but possibly we have to be read it qualitatively as well, not just quantitatively. I've provided a little bit of overview here, and I leave that. Maybe people can read that. Also, very useful sometimes is instead of using pivot tables, crosstabs, and look at maybe the number of fines as opposed to the magnitude. And we can apply a similar analysis here, where we look at the regulators and look at what the fines were being applied for and the number of fines. So 15 fines, Federal Housing Agency, and that was for mortgage-backed securities. And sanctions, money laundering, no fines were imposed by California, state of California, for money laundering, tax evasion sanctions in the Financial Times data set. But if we come down, I'm sure if we go to Department of Justice, we have the Department of Justice here, and it applied 11 fines for that. and the Department of Treasury applied 10 fines, and 1 from the federal FDIC, 3 fines by the Federal Reserve. But you notice here, Freddie Mac is not active here in applying fines for sanctions or tax evasion, money laundering. And it's those bigger agencies that seem to be involved. Okay. Okay, so we can run that and get that. So that's all coming. We're basically taking our data fines, the FT dataset, and bringing that FT dataset and setting up pivot tables. And we're really following the spirit. If we look at the visualizations here, parsing through the type of detail that's documented in terms of the stacked bar charts and so on, which we'll do using MATLAB and Plotly later. You can see much of the story that has been told here in terms of the analysis can be brought to life using Google Colab and or Jupyter Notebooks more generally. And once you build a template, then if the data set changes or amends or you want to update, these commands can be quite useful in running those type of queries. Okay, so we'll come a little bit further down. We've done our crosstabs, interpretation, different regulators. I'll leave this here, people can read themselves. And in the next video clip, I'll touch on how to visualize the information that we obtained from our pivot tables and from our crosstabs using Matplotlib and Plotly.